The situation is always saying, would you give love in this event? Or would I give myself love in this event?
Mm-hmm.
By just forgiving the scenario, realizing that I made it up and forgiving myself for what I haven't really done,
Mm-hmm.
that's how I say I've forgiven this lesson and I have no more use for it.
Como você está? Let's start healing. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Murchison, and welcome back to the Let's Start Healing podcast. I just greeted you with "How are you?" in Portuguese. Como você está? And that's because we have more in common than we think, and what we have in common can change the world. This episode is brought to you in part by BE Decor's Interior Decorating and Styling Company, where interior decorator Lynetta Chanel Duncan will creatively personalize and style spaces in your home or office to complement your quality of life. BE Decor's specialty is creating living spaces, including she caves. Chanel Duncan's idea for She Caves comes from her passion for helping women practice self-care. She Caves are offered under the brand She Works, She Slays, She Caves. Visit BE Decors at bedecors.com. You can also find BE Decors on social media at BE Decors. Our guest today is James Sims, who has been on our podcast a few times now. And I always enjoy when he's with us because he is a very, very deep young man. He is very much exploring his spiritual path. He's staying in tune with his higher power, who for him is the Holy Spirit and God. And he is listening and he is moving in the direction that feels right for him. If he makes a decision and then that decision doesn't feel right, he will let it go and he will keep it moving. And he's going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about so many things. And James, like myself, is a student of A Course in Miracles. Here and there, I'll touch on A Course in Miracles and we'll explain what it's all about. It was a book that was documented, for lack of a better word at the moment, by a woman named Helen Schuckman, who's no longer living. But in the 60s, she heard Jesus talking to her. She was a psychologist at Columbia Presbyterian in New York, and she heard the voice of Jesus, and he said to her, "This is A Course in Miracles, take notes." It was over a series of months, I believe, that Jesus would talk to her and she would share it with her colleague and they documented it and it became A Course in Miracles. You can find the book online in Barnes and Noble, many, many different places. A lot of people discover A Course in Miracles. I did years and years ago through Marianne Williamson before she decided that she was going to run for president. She was known for her teachings of A Course in Miracles. And people have different interpretations of it. People come to it of all different faiths. I grew up Catholic and it really spoke to me from my sensibilities. There are people who come to it from the Jewish faith, from Islam, from all kinds of traditional religion. This is not a traditional path. Although Jesus is talking about the Holy Spirit and God, it can be interpreted in so many different ways because it all comes down to love. And what the book is saying is that we are one. We see ourselves as individuals. I see you, you see me, but we are one, truly one spirit. We are one holy, loving, perfect child of God. And the book talks about how it's how we forget who we are. We're spirits having a human experience. We forget who we are according to A Course in Miracles. And that's where we get tripped up and we make judgments about each other, or we do things that we regret or maybe don't regret, but may harm another person or harm ourselves. And so the book brings us back to a knowing and a sense of who we truly are. And it is all about love, and that's why I love it so much. Although I'm trying to make it clear and simple, it is a very, very deep book. I wanted to share a little bit about it because certain things come up when James and I are talking, and I don't want anyone to be confused. And there's an idea in A Course in Miracles that it's not only A Course in Miracles that will talk about this. There's other faiths that talk about it as well, and other non-traditional faiths. And that is that this world, as we see it, is an illusion. It's not real. And the idea is that anything that can be changed isn't real. It's only the changeless that's real. So, for example, when I pass away, my spirit will continue. That is my belief. That is my knowing. And so, therefore, my body isn't real. That's an example of illusion that may come up in the conversation with me and James. Usually when he brings up the word, we're talking about the world being an illusion or the world being a dream. Let's meet him. Let's get started, and let's start healing. Welcome back, James.
Thank you, Adrian. It's such a pleasure to be back. You know, I always enjoy these podcasts with you.
I really feel honored that you're here and always enjoy when you're here. And we were having a great conversation yesterday on mindfulness, I think, and even judgment that we can. I know I was talking about trying to overcome judgment sometimes. Would you share any thoughts that come to your mind around mindfulness?
Sure. So when I think of mindfulness, I think of always taking responsibility for my illusions. And I know that if I'm being triggered by someone else, then being mindful, I can ask myself, what part of me does this trigger? What aspect that I haven't forgiven within myself does this represent?
Mm-hmm.
Because going to A Course in Miracles, I often think about the section titled The Hero of the Dream. And it says that I'll think that my brothers are doing to me what I think I've done to them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not even something that I remember. Maybe it's from another lifetime. But if I'm getting triggered about something I think someone else is doing, then it's really a question of self-forgiveness and my unforgiveness for what I think I've done at some point in the illusion.
And so you're writing a book, and you're a beautiful writer.
Oh, thank you.
You're just a really beautiful writer. You're writing a book that is inspired, is it correct to say, by A Course in Miracles?
It is. A lot of it's inspired by the Course, and it's also inspired by, I guess, my practical application of the Course. So knowing from the Course, I've learned that all of this is a dream. And so I write my experiences in this form of the dream and also from a lot of my lucid dreams. And I oftentimes write it from A Course in Miracles perspective and with the Course in Miracles take. So it is predominantly inspired by the Course, but you'll also see a lot of other elements too, and a few other philosophies, though it is predominantly Course.
And so through your experiences, what is one of the core messages you want to get across to the reader?
Yeah, so the core message is one of love and one of our purity within, because within we're gold, we're worth more than gold within. And so the message is just that inside we're innately valuable, and it's to teach that the message of the Course is I need do nothing, which of course means there's no shame in doing anything. But I've lived a lot of my life up until recently thinking that my value came from what I did. So the message is just that what we are is innately created, and our reality within can neither be made nor broken by anything on the outside. So we're already everything we're trying to become. It's a general message.
Right. A lot of us are taught that works is how we get to what we want, spiritually and literally in our life. It's good works. I've been trying to think of that phrase, but I don't know. The more you do, the more that comes to you. I can't think of the phrase that I want to use, but we're taught that it's good works. So that's sort of would you say a contradiction or what?
It is. And I see, and that is a prime example of what I think would be kind of mindlessness. And it's just the way the world thinks. And obviously I've been in that state of mindlessness for lifetimes, even for the majority of this lifetime. Now I'm just kind of awakening for the first time, probably over the last 3 years or so. But I also was of the belief that it was all from works, while in actuality, it's an inside job, which is why the Course teaches early in the Course, it says, this is a course in cause and not effect. It also teaches that behavior is really a symbol of what I'm thinking. So once my thoughts change, the behavior it'll change on its own. But I know a lot of other religions are oriented predominantly on behavior, but adjusting our behavior really won't change our thoughts. Our thoughts, on the other hand, can change our behavior.
Yeah, and I have to say, for my own life, well, first of all, someone sent a phrase to me the other day that said, "What's for me will come to me." And in the chorus, it says, "What's for you is yours." And if I look at my own life, the things that I've really wanted, whether it was a job or it was a situation that I wanted to take place, they all happen not from me being dogged to get that particular thing. That particular thing would come to me, but it did come from me being on my path. I do find that I was on my path trying to accomplish something, but the ultimate thing that was best for me, that I wanted, that made me happy, it wasn't something that I went out and got. It was something that came to me. So do you find that for yourself?
Exactly. And I think I came to this realization on a very powerful level. It might have been something psychic, but I think the time that I actually said this, we were visiting a friend in the hospital a few months ago. And as the three of us sat there, I just said that it occurred to me that all of this Course in Miracles community came about in such a way that really wasn't my own planning. Surely enough, I had the willingness to follow the Holy Spirit's guidance to find this community. But in the end, I could never have planned it out, and I was never planning the outcome, saying, I'm going to go here in 2 years from now, 2+ years from now, I'm still going to be going to this group. None of that was in my planning. And that's how I'm really starting to see what the Course says. It says in Lesson 135, if I defend myself, I am attacked. The healed mind does not make plans. And had it been in my planning, I would have simply been following the ego's unconscious script. And it definitely wouldn't have had the beautiful outcome that this has had for me.
So can you speak to your own spiritual growth and evolution? I was just listening to Michael Bernard Beckwith, which I'll share in a little bit, and he was just talking about the different ways that we evolve, sort of like what the journey is. And how would you describe your journey?
Yes, so my journey has been one that's gone from predominantly outward to predominantly inward. And this is something that I've also written in the book. And I talk about the way initially I grew up under the household of a father who was very oriented in behavior, and also very controlling in terms of staying under his roof or whatever. Some may call it cultish, which it fairly enough it was, you know.
And when you say in behavior, what was that like? Like, did you grow up in a traditional religion?
So it wasn't
structure?
A traditional religion. It's what my brother has often referred to as dark Christianity. So I mean,
dark Christianity. Ooh.
and so a lot of his beliefs were derived from Christianity, but then they were kind of egocentric. So at the same time, he would put himself at the center of his kind of own religion, but he would follow the same modalities of eternal hell, either eternal hell or eternal heaven, to put the pressure on. And of course, my later discoveries of reincarnation in my past lives, well, he would have been opposed to that in much the same way that that churches in the older days were also opposed to the belief in reincarnation for the same reason. Because then the belief that we'll be here again kind of takes away the incentive of fear of saying, well, get it right now or suffer for eternity. But as my journey went on, and as I started meditating, which I started in 2012, at least for the first time in this lifetime, I started getting messages that it would take me 4 years to actually fully understand. For example, the Holy Spirit said to me, live because you've died a lot, which was a direct correlation to my past lives. And it also said to me, you're the boss of your own life. So it wanted me to know that even though I was having the experience of seemingly being a victim, it was actually the same message as the Course lesson, I am not the victim of the world I see. And so by realizing that I wanted my dad to be in that position so I could project my unconscious guilt onto him, I was no longer able to see it in the same way, and that has sped up the process of forgiveness. Now, he's still a dream figure that many times they may not necessarily see with the most positive insight from a lot of past memories and stuff. But then I also remember that the Course says all your past except his beauty is gone. And so the more I start to realize that, the more I really realize more and more that there really is nothing to forgive. And whatever I do think has to be forgiven, again, it's just coming from what I haven't forgiven over the course of my soul's journey.
Right.
And I projected that onto him.
Right. Right. And so where are you now? Like, I know you just described your evolution. How would you describe where you are today?
So where I am now is a place of seeking more inner guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I couldn't have even been here without where I was. And one example of that is, my older sister, who still lives in Birmingham, she taught me about the phenomenon of lucid dreaming. And it wouldn't be until, again, like years later that I really got into that.
And what does that mean, lucid?
Oh, yeah.
Present,
so
seem
lucid
real?
dreaming is awareness of a dream.
Mm-hmm.
So in a lucid dream, we know we're dreaming when we're in the dream. Something weird may happen, and it may just trigger like, hey, I'm in a dream.
Mm-hmm.
And those have been times where I've had a lot of unconscious memories come to me, many times from past lives,
Mm-hmm.
and also just higher messages from the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so using those in addition to the presence of mind and in waking life, just following my inner guidance, following my clairvoyance. And another kind of nifty thing that my dad taught me, again, I have to say, I really do have to say that, forgiveness lessons aside, I chose a spiritual genius for a dad in this lifetime. And that's really what I've also come to the conclusion of.
Mm-hmm.
And he would also have the ability of clairvoyance. And he told me that I would sometimes tell him about my clairvoyant experiences from the angels I would see that were very clear, transparent, to like the flashing lights I would see that would correspond to my positive thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And he just knew what these things were and would say that this is just confirmation or whatever. And those experiences for me have continued. And something that I've also been talking about to my friend McAllison, is that just not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So just because he may not have learned all forgiveness lessons and may have been acting as my projection or whatever, doesn't mean that he wasn't teaching me things that coincided with the Holy Spirit. And so I can see that the Holy Spirit is just repurposing everything that I have experienced up until this point, that I will come to the day where I'll just really realize experientially, not just intellectually, that all my past except His beauty is gone, and even the past was for my best interests.
Yeah, and I'm aware that this is really heavy and deep and complicated for some folks. So what we're saying, tell me if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but basically we are here to grow and learn. I look at, and I've come to this through studying A Course in Miracles, I see my life as love. And if I don't see everything in love, then what's not love are lessons God would have me learn so that I can get back to love. Because I came from God and God is love. And so, do you agree with that so far?
Oh, exactly. That's perfect.
Yeah. So if I have somebody in my life, whether it's a parent or a friend or just a figure in my life that I'm having some agita with that's real, then that's a lesson for me that's a exercise in forgiveness or opportunity for forgiveness for me to forgive myself for whatever's taking place or whatever I think is taking place and whatever I'm projecting onto this person that's I think is real, and to forgive them also, which is really that's kind of what you were saying, right?
Oh, exactly. That perfectly sums it up.
Yeah. Like we're here because, and also when we talk about past lives, which I know not everybody, is comfortable with or agrees with, but it's ultimately, for the sake of argument, which I'm not arguing about it, but if there's, it's ultimately, everything is to get back to God. And sometimes, we might take a longer path, and the longer path might look a certain way. Maybe we might show as various people. That's what you're explaining, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
Now, me, I've already said, I'm not coming back anymore. I don't know if I've been here before. I kind of think I have, but I'm not coming back.
I'm right with you there.
So, yeah, that kind of goes into what you were saying a little, unpacks it a little bit.
It does. Yes. And I guess as we start to better conceptualize what real love is, we just realize that there's really no need anymore for substitutes for love. because the Course teaches that everything in this illusion is nothing but a substitute for love. And the more we can actually experientially know what love is, then the less of a need we have to settle for less than that. I always love thinking about the section of the Course titled Littleness versus Magnitude, in which Jesus begins by saying, "Be not content with littleness." And this has been a big lesson for me to learn. It's been a big lesson for me to learn in terms of going for perhaps careers that have been kind of binding for me and playing small, as one of the Course in Miracles teachers, Jennifer Hatley, often says. And this particular saying, "Be not content with littleness," really came to mind after this one particular lucid dream I had, which I've also put in the book. And in this lucid dream, it was dark and I couldn't see a thing. And normally when I know I'm dreaming, I'm able to change the lighting effects of the area by just saying mantras or whatever. But this time there was some lesson that was meant to be learned, and until I learned that lesson, the darkness would just continue.
Do you know what the lesson was?
The lesson was actually to have faith. So I was basically trying to control spirit on my own terms and saying, "Spirit, I'm only going to move once you show me a way," while spirit was telling me of the importance of faithfulness. And interestingly enough, faithfulness is also one of the 10 characteristics of the teacher of God in the Manual for Teachers.
Within the Course in Miracles.
In the Course in Miracles. And so eventually when I realized that my goal, my only lesson, my only part in this whole thing was just to have the faith to be guided without having to see the whole, because I could never fathom the whole anyway.
Right.
Was just to move ahead.
Right.
And it was only after moving forward that I could see the light. And then upon the light surfacing, I could then see a small elephant being bound by a thin chain. And this elephant was symbolic of my playing small. And though I didn't realize it at the time, which is why I asked the elephant, "What do you represent?" And it didn't answer. As soon as I woke up from this dream, the message was as clear as day. And then I just titled that lucid dream, "Be not content with littleness," from the Course.
Wow. And so the chain represented the playing small.
And the being bound. At this time, I was also working at Walmart, and kind of the Holy Spirit had already told me that wasn't for me. And I had been given this dream per my request, because the night before I had said, "Well, if you're really telling me I need to quit this job, then give me a lucid dream in which you illustrate this." And that's exactly what Spirit did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing, because that was just over the holidays. You seem very content. You seem full in terms of being able to just study your spirituality. You seem really like that makes you really full. And when you were there at Walmart, it was like just the schedule, not having the freedom, because you were bound to a schedule. It was like, I could see it like either like a tiger in a cage walking back and forth, or like an elephant, like, what is this on my foot? I have a visual like that,
Really?
Yeah, because I think we all, I'm becoming aware of how I think our nature, we don't want to be bound. We don't like when people even tell us what to do. I think about that sometimes. Like, why is the simplest thing of somebody telling us what to do so annoying? But that's because it's limiting. It's limiting. You're saying, no, I can't be free. And it's just, we want the freedom to do what we want. And why shouldn't we have the freedom to do what we want? That doesn't mean we don't have responsibilities, but we want the freedom. It's against our nature, I think, to not be free.
It is. And what you said is very powerful, because I think society tries to teach us that obedience to the external is a way to live a successful life. And then it's interesting that successful kind of even loses its traditional meaning in the Course terms, because there's a lesson of the Course that says, "I do not know my own best interest."
Right.
And so if I don't know my own best interest, then I don't really know what success is, but I can be sure of what it's not, and that it's not having anything to do with anything external. And so I guess the more I really realize to look within, I know that my value, as I've often said, is already determined. And with that being the case, I no longer have the need to prove a point. And I was even saying to my friends in Asheville this weekend, as I was having dinner with them and kind of going over my spiritual path, I said that right now I do feel freer than ever before, just to be able to live in accordance to Spirit without having to worry about the the ifs and all this other stuff that I can't really see anyway. It's like one of the lessons of the Course says, I place my future in the hands of God. And obviously I still have more lessons to learn, more faithfulness to exercise and strengthen, but this is probably the most certain I've ever been in practicing this actual lesson. And I think I'm going now from theorizing the saying I need do nothing to kind of living it. It's becoming more of my experience, and to know that spirit will provide for me. And this is also something that's been confirmed by several psychics. It's interesting because every time I see a psychic, it's almost the same message of saying that my spirit guides want me to know they're with me. They want me to know I'm protected.
Mm-hmm.
Like almost all the ones say these same things, and these messages also coincide with what I'm told in my lucid dreams. Like for example, and this is another one of my favorite dreams I actually put in the book. In this particular dream, I fly through a window and I see a dwarf planet in the distance. At the time, it doesn't have any life, but once I fly into it, it lights up. It even forms eyes, and then it forms a mouth, from which it's...
Did you say this is a planet?
It's a small planet.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and I almost like, in dreams, it's kind of hard to describe, but the ethereal body is abstract. So in dreams, I can kind of pass through solid objects. And I partially enter the planet, and when I partially enter it, it gives it life. And then it has eyes and a mouth. And from the mouth it speaks, you've been looked after by Fantasia this whole time.
Mm.
And I have a kind of claircognizance in the dream, kind of clear knowing. And I know that Fantasia just means all of the gods,
Mm-hmm.
which means, of course, every part of God, every spirit guide, all the angels, whichever way you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And, lo and behold, later I'm given a book. My friend Carrie gives me this book of inner work. And this is about a year after I've had the dream, but then I see that Fantasia indeed it means essentially it means the link between the divine world and the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of the process of manifestation. And the message, which I even understood at the time, even though I hadn't read it in a book, was that all forms of spirit, all my guides will always provide for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I can experientially say that has been the case, even when I haven't known what's around the corner.
Yeah. Spirit guides are a whole nother thing. I wanted to bring up Michael Bernard Beckwith because he was talking about the recording I was listening to. He was talking about sort of the evolution, like basically of a spiritual journey. So some of us could be in a place where we see ourselves as the victim of everything. So everything is happening to us. And to get out of that space is really about forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
to evolve. And then the next part, if I remember, is, and I feel like I've been through this, is where, the next part is sort of a spiritual practice every day. And then we can grow from a daily spiritual practice. We find ourselves, he says, slowly evolving from a daily spiritual practice. And then another part is where maybe we'll go through a difficult time. And then all of a sudden we'll realize that difficult time has sort of advanced us spiritually. Or after we've come through that time, we'll look back and we'll see I'm different now. I feel like that's what I've been through recently. And then the final, I shouldn't use that word. I don't know that he used that word, but another aspect beyond that is being able to manifest, being able to understand that we have the power within ourselves. That he doesn't use the word God, I don't think, but, let's just say our divine energy, our higher power, he calls love beauty, that's within us, and we can connect with the universe, and that there's a divine order to things. Just like he used, which I enjoyed, the buoyancy of the ocean has its own divine order of things that we can't disrupt. I think maybe we can not be a part of it or think we're not a part of it. But so he was just sort of incorporating that's, there's a whole nother level of power within that, which I feel like you're speaking to also. Does that resonate for you?
There he is. And again, I think about lesson 25. I do not know what anything is for. And I think 26 is the one that proceeds it. I do not know my own best interests. And so it's easy for me to be in a moment thinking that it must be against me, forgetting altogether that I made it up and that it's actually coming from me.
Mm-hmm.
But then even so, even though I've made it up, and perhaps the first purpose was always the purpose of the ego, the Course says the ego always speaks first loudest and is always wrong. And so the first purpose of the experience definitely would have been with my ego to keep me in a state of mindlessness. The beauty, though, is that the Holy Spirit's second purpose for the illusion, which is then always my awakening. So it doesn't matter how seemingly horrific the dream is, the Holy Spirit will essentially repurpose it in such a way that with my willingness, even that will be for my highest and best.
In dream, we mean walking around here in this world.
In this world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go on.
And I like the way in the lesson 26, where Jesus has me say, I do not perceive my own best interest in this situation. So he'll have me look at different scenarios, say the way I would like for them to turn out, perhaps contrary to the way they're seemingly turning out. But then just to conclude, I do not know my own best interest in this situation. And that helps me to get by also, mm-hmm. and to realize that even though it's come from me, perhaps with the first purpose to keep me in a state of mindlessness, even that with the Holy Spirit mm-hmm. will guide me towards the mindfulness of my nature.
Right. I'm so aware that I don't know my best interests. I'm so aware of that. So it is about walking in faith. And I do believe in my own heart, because I believe my heart and God's heart are the same, and that if I'm in purity, if I'm in pure love, that's the same as God's will. Mm-hmm. So I do try to think about, what do I really want? And sometimes I don't know, because I don't know what's in my best interest. And I think that's okay. And I think it's okay to be uncertain and say I'm scared, or to be in perfect awareness of this feels. I think when we're really in something in our heart, it's a physical feeling too. Do you think so?
It is. And I think that perfectly sums up clairsentience. And it's interesting because I've told you many times that you and your family members seem to possess a clairsentience that's kind of seems to be very generational.
Which is feeling.
And clairsentience is clear feeling. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I guess the more I connect to my heart, it also becomes more of my experience. I'm also starting to become more aware of my clairsentient tendencies, whereas first my primary go-tos are probably still clairvoyance, which is clear seeing, and clairaudience, clear hearing. Mm-hmm. But now as I meditate and can feel more positive energy of others, I am also becoming aware of the feeling, and that the feeling can also be very representative. In fact, the Course says that anytime I'm not experiencing joy, then it's always because I'm not being wholly loving to one of God's creations. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of truth in the feelings, and it's what Jennifer Hadley, a Course teacher, refers to as a spiritual alarm clock. And then another thing I cover in the book is that it's actually in my best interest that I experience the fear or the anger or whatever it is that's letting me know that I'm miscreating. Because to not experience it would be very similar to an athlete who uses painkillers to avoid feeling the pain of playing a sport. Mm-hmm. Well, just because they're using painkillers doesn't mean they're not doing damage to the joints or ligaments. And in much the same way, if I didn't experience fear, perhaps because you do hear of some, I guess, narcissist psychopaths who are to the point of not even being able to feel when they're miscreating. Mm-hmm. But just because they're not feeling it doesn't mean that they're not miscreating. It doesn't mean that they're not going in the way of the light.
Right.
So it's in my best interest that I feel whatever. If I feel that I'm going in the right direction, or feel that I'm miscreating, because therein the correction lies.
Yeah. And also on the other side of that, like when you were saying that your spirit guides are always with you and you've been told that, I thought of Michael Beckwith also, because he was given a message, that everything was going to work out with him when he was very young and in legal trouble. And I thought, you know what? It's interesting because even if we're not told that, things are going to still work out. Mm-hmm. Like we may not hear it. And so we don't think that it's going to work out, but not hearing it doesn't make it any less true. Mm-mm. I want to hear it though, but I think the flip side also, what you just said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not hearing it doesn't mean that we're not told it either. We have to keep in mind that we're all really receiving all the time. One of the workbook lessons of A Course in Miracles says God's voice speaks to me all through the day. Mm-hmm. And so we're always really receiving. And, you know, the Holy Spirit is telling all of us, our spirit guides, our angels are always telling us that everything is okay. The question is, do we have blocks that are
Yes.
impeding our being aware of that message?
Yes, yes. And you were talking about the journey for you has been faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the journey, at least currently, has been acceptance of joy. I was looking up to see what something meant, and it was like being willing to receive joy. My dreams have related to that. And trust, being able to trust others, being able to trust myself to bring me to happiness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting the way things will show up.
It is. Because whatever we're meant to know and whatever is on our mind, whatever spirit is trying to run by us, it will show in dreams.
It will.
Would you care to give the example of any of your dreams of how that relates?
I was just having a revelation too. It's so funny what our subconscious does, because one of my dreams was my brother was showing up in my dream who passed, and he was just being really mean, and I didn't like him. I remember there was somebody in my dream that I really liked, and I was trying to connect with this figure in the dream. And I remember being in a room. Well, actually, before that even happened, my brother chopped off my hand. Then I remember being in a room, but it wasn't like my hand was bleeding or anything. I was just in a room with one hand, and somebody comes in the door, and I wanted to tell this person how I felt about them. Like, I had this real good feeling about this person. I wanted to tell them how I felt about them. And you know how a door opens and maybe there's somebody behind the door, but you can't see who it is yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my brother. And when I was like, oh, like I was hoping it was this other person. And when I was trying to figure out what this dream meant, I realized that for me, it was about having enough faith in myself, enough trust in myself to trust someone else and to love someone else. And I was willing to have my hand cut off to either prevent me from getting to that awareness or to get me to that awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a movie person. And I remember that, I have a lot of movie scenes in my head. And I remembered Moonstruck. It's probably a movie you haven't seen, but there's this movie called Moonstruck. Nicolas Cage. This has nothing to do with the overall movie, but he only has one hand because he was a butcher and he cut off his hand.
Wow.
And supposedly he cut off his hand so he wouldn't have to marry his fiance, because his fiance left him because he only had one hand. And so just a little while ago, I was watching that movie, like today.
Wow.
Now, I had this dream and these thoughts like weeks ago.
Wow.
But it's funny that we're talking about it. And so it's like what you could do to avoid your own happiness, if that makes any sense.
And that's a powerful connection. That's a really powerful connection.
Yeah.
And it also kind of goes back to the Course in the way it says that everything is either a call for love or an expression of love. And it says that, of course, all forms of sickness or anything that would be painful can be seen as a call for love.
Mm-hmm.
And so even that example of the movie, and it's interesting, right? Because calls for love are very insane and very contradictory. So the way we can call for love is oftentimes a way that will actually push people away, and I guess that was his intention. So it just shows how those things can work. But interestingly, of course, it can work the other way too. I find it powerful that you said in your dream that having your hand cut off was either an opportunity to keep them away or to let them in, because again, everything can be given the second purpose of the Holy Spirit, which is always for unification.
Mm-hmm.
And so even when we do experience a hard event, which, even though the script is written, perhaps there are certain events that wouldn't have to occur. Perhaps we could transition to higher scripts by learning forgiveness lessons, hence the lesson 193, all things are lessons God would have me learn. But regardless of where we think we are, there's always a way. And there's never really any room for regret, because we're always just being guided by Spirit like a GPS system. And it's always, regardless of the experience, even if we're experiencing a, quote, lower scenario, then the GPS is always saying recalculating and still guiding us home in the way that's best for us still.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, let's shift gears and speak about karma.
So within the dream, and of course, I'd like to start by saying karma is an illusion, but within the dream, it's the system of cause and effect. And of course, the Course teaches that to give and to receive are one in truth. And of course, therefore, what I'm giving, I am having.
Mm-hmm.
And so karma is essentially the means by which I get to see everything I've given to a brother or sister. And whatever my experience is, I can rest assured that I've given it to someone in the past. And so what I've done to someone in one lifetime, it may not even be this lifetime, it will be my experience in this lifetime. And it's kind of a self-punishment system, which of course goes back into the insanity. But in my most immediate lifetime, which, ended 45 years before this one began, 1945, I was a German soldier in that lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, kind of playing the role of a bad guy, so to speak, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
What makes sense as to why I would kind of bind myself in this lifetime. But to look at it from a more constructive purpose, karma is really seeking to teach us, at least from the Holy Spirit's perspective, because then I can see that, like, what was the common denominator of my lifetime as a German and my other lifetimes as a warrior? Well, it was that I was always centered on conformity. So I was always centered on following the masses, which of course is not at all the fastest way to awakening. So since my biggest lesson to learn was to break conformity, then it would make perfect sense that my soul would decide to be born under the roof of a dad who would want me to conform and to stay in that scenario. And there comes the counterintuitive part of karma, because my karmic lesson was to do the very opposite of what was lined up for me to do, which would have been to stay there and to be controlled. But in this lifetime, I had determined that I was going to break that cycle of conformity, which is why I ultimately did leave that situation.
Most people think of karma as what goes around comes around. Is that an oversimplification?
In a way, because also, if we forgive, if we forgive ourselves for what we haven't done, if we can look back either in this lifetime or a past lifetime and say, well, I'm really innocent, and not just to say it intellectually, but to really know it in our hearts.
Yeah.
Then, as one of the workbook lessons says, 169, by grace I live, by grace I am released. By grace I give, by grace I will release. So by really letting go of that illusion of karma, we can then experience the state of grace.
Right. And that's why I asked about that simplification, because perhaps someone doesn't have to go through multiple lifetimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You wrote, attaining appreciation for all events in our lives is how we can transcend the illusory laws of karma. And being loving at the face of seeming anger-inducing scenarios, we can end the cycle of hate that would otherwise constantly repeat itself in our lives. It is through this method that we can learn that we are worthy of nothing but perfect love and perfect happiness, and that all are as well.
And that's the scenario, because looking at it from that perspective, every karma that I've written into my script is really just a call for love from myself.
Yeah.
So in every event, it doesn't matter from whom is coming. In every event, whether it's an accident or a person, the situation is always saying, would you give love in this event? Or would I give myself love in this event?
Mm-hmm.
By just forgiving the scenario, realizing that I made it up and forgiving myself for what I haven't really done.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I say I've forgiven this lesson and I have no more use for it. On the contrary, however, by saying that this is really bad, I'm really the victim of this, and I really have nothing to do with this, that state of denial is a very thing that will have the lesson repeating itself, perhaps lifetime after lifetime, if I'm so stubborn as to not accept it within this lifetime. But it's really always a matter of how stubborn I want to be.
So how is the practical application a lot of times? Even though you're on your spiritual journey and you have a lot more freedom than a lot of us do, doesn't mean you're perfect.
Obviously
I know people
not.
probably rub you the wrong way sometimes. How do you handle that? What happens?
Yes, so in those situations, I always just resort to the course's methodology. And what I love about the workbook lessons is that they're not a matter of if but when. The course doesn't say if you're triggered, but it says when you're triggered, think these things. And one of my favorites is from the lesson, I am oneself united with my creator.
Yeah.
So when triggered by someone, I will say to that soul on the level of the mind, you are oneself with me, united with our creator in this self. I honor you because of what I am and what God is, who loves us both as one. And though this may not necessarily clear up the feeling right away, just by seeing beyond the veil and giving it over to spirit and knowing that what I'm seeing is really my projection, it's my form of self-punishment. And the more I see that, the more I realize that the only thing I'm forgiving is my perceived lack of love.
Yeah. It's a surrender. That's beautiful. It does work to say those words. Like there's other words in the course prayers that I'll repeat, and they do work. It's a surrender. It's a shift in our vibration from a negative feeling to a willingness to love. And that's all that it takes is a willingness to love. Right?
Yeah, it's only the willingness. And there's even a section of the course titled The Little Willingness. You know, our little willingness is all that it takes for Spirit to do the rest. And again, for us to think that I have to do this big task of enlightenment, that's not the truth at all. All I have to do is give the willingness to forgive, and let Spirit do the rest.
Mm-hmm. And so I know we talked a little bit, I think this would classify as a miracle, just your life and the progression over the last few years and the community that's around you. But what, can you share any other types of miracles that may have taken place in your life?
Oh, yes. So my miracles are always in the form of symbolism. And then I really start realizing that what the Course says is true in one of the 50 miracle principles, that if a miracle is not happening, something has gone wrong. Because there's also a workbook lesson that says miracles are seen in light. So the question isn't if I'm receiving the miracle, but the question is, am I in the light to see it? And for me, so light is one of my biggest miracles. Just seeing flashes of light when I'm told that I'm being guided in a certain way. You know, it can even be clairaudient experiences of just sitting in meditation and hearing that Spirit is interacting with me by perhaps making sounds or things around me. And since I'm kind of accustomed to it, I just will say thank you for the confirmation. And I had one very kind of miraculous event where, you know, so the house I'm currently staying in Atlanta, it has this light, this particular light leading into the hallway, or that there was this hallway leading into my room. And this light had probably been off for about 3 weeks. And I'd flipped this light on and off, you know, to no avail. It just wouldn't turn on. And this one night in the middle of the night, like around 4 o'clock, I was just doing a meditation. And it was a gratitude meditation. I was closing the meditation with gratitude to Spirit, saying, just thank you for guiding me on this path. And I could see a lot of those as clairvoyant flashes of light. And the Course talks about these episodes of light too. And in addition to seeing the light, I then just could hear also sounds of energy around me. And I said to Spirit, you know, thank you for the confirmation. And and then when I opened my eyes up from this meditation, the light in the hallway that had been off for probably about a month, it was all of a sudden it had turned on its own. And it was just it was again the message of saying miracles are seen in light. And it was just it's those kinds of symbols that are just big miracles to me.
I had a similar an akin experience recently, because a family member passed who I had not a family member, a friend of the family passed, who I had known their family my whole life. You know, our families were friends my whole life, and this is the last person who was living, and he passed tragically. And I have a thing where somebody might pass and I'll ask my parents, my late parents, to let them know that I love them, or to go see them, or I don't know how that works, but something in me asked them to do that. And so this man always thought of me as like a little girl. You know how people, they only know you as a child, and no matter how old you get, they just see you as a child. You know, so I hadn't talked to him in a few years, and I remember the night that I found out he had passed that day, I was just really upset. And so I just asked my parents, I was like, well, I know, you know, it wasn't like we had that kind of relationship where I felt like God would take me to the man. So I just asked my parents to, you know, let him know that I loved him. You know, I mean, I don't know how much that matters, but, you know, could you just let him know that I love him? And I'm walking down this hallway, and I walk past before we get to my door, there's a lamp on the table, and the light went out for about 3 seconds. It went out for about 3 seconds. It wasn't like a flicker, because a flicker would have been like 1 second. It was about like 3 seconds. And it came back on. And I almost talked myself out of thinking that was a message, you know? And then the more I thought about it, I was like, no, that was a response. That was a response.
It's true.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you would, again, it's an electronic kind of scenario, because Spirit does like to use like to use electronics also to communicate with us. And that's definitely an example. And it's just a sign that obviously death is an illusion. One of my
Yeah.
favorite workbook lessons of the Course, I want to say it's like 163, there is no death, the Son of God is free. And
Mm-hmm.
so it really is just true. Like whether we're in a body or not has nothing to do with our existence. And so even when others make their transition and they're no longer having the body experience, which quite honestly is a liberating experience for them, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're no longer able to contact us. They're there with us in the many ways
Yes.
that we can listen. Again, it's only a matter of not are they there, but are there blocks in us preventing us from being aware of that connection with them?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get like too weird on people, but sometimes I think about like how much is going on that we can't see. Just beings that are higher than us.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to talk to you more about that
Yeah,
offline.
for sure. But I know what you're saying, though. And
Yeah.
I think at the same time, it's also important for us to realize that there really is no hierarchy. And
Yeah.
even in the Course, Jesus says to see him as an elder brother because we're equals.
Mm-hmm.
So even though my spirit guides who are guiding me, they're definitely symbolic of the whole, whereas my illusory experience is definitely one of fragmentation. Even they want me to know that in actuality that we're of that same level. But in the illusion of time, I definitely am behind. And in those senses, they give me information that otherwise I wouldn't know
Oh,
in a
because
given
they
moment.
can see what already
Because
is that we can't see.
because they're out
It's
of the
already
illusion of time.
right. It's already happened. It's all
hmm
going on at once.
It's all happening at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
hmm
I don't know why I have an understanding of that. I always have. I don't know why. It's kind of bizarre to me.
Well, your soul just knows it. It's just a knowing. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about like the flashes of light. Sometimes I have like lately I'll have these flashes of light just out the side
hmm
of my eye. Does that
hmm
happen to you?
Yes, it does.
So what
And
is
and
that?
those were actually how they began with me. And so it's just a sign that we're approximating the light. And there's actually a workbook lesson that talks about this. Don't quote me on it, but I
Within
want to
the
say that it
Course in
might
Miracles,
be.
the workbook.
I want
Okay.
to I want to say it might be lesson number 12 or around there. And it
Mm-hmm.
says that as we start becoming more open to the truth, we will see flashes of light which are symbolic of the truth. And it says that though these lights are not the truth themselves, they're
Mm-hmm.
representative of the truth. And they may not last, but they are there to let us know that we're
Okay.
going in the right direction. And I
Oh.
guess if spirit knows that they're a preferred form of communication, which for me they are,
Mm-hmm.
then they can last during an earthly experience for as long as they're necessary or helpful.
And so it
Mm-hmm.
started with flickers of light, flashes of
Mm-hmm.
light for you, and then that increased.
It did.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I still see the ones in the corner of my eye too. Sometimes I still see those ones, but other times I can also see one that's kind of more of a halo that can either go from right to left, or typically I think it goes like from right to left, but other times it can be from left to right, and it can just be a kind of, like I said, kind of like around the crown chakra area.
You'll
But
see it where? On people in the mirror, or like where do you
I
see
just
it?
kind of see it in my field of vision, like just kind of like above my head. And
Uh-huh. So is it that you're looking in the mirror, or is that
no,
you all of a sudden have like
it's
sort of
just
a way that you can
mm-hmm.
just sort of see yourself outside of yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
In a
right?
way, and it's kind of a thought too, because it's the way spirit communicates with me. It may also be when my eyes are open, or even more so when my eyes are closed, and I might just be lying in bed, and spirit just says to me, you're doing well, James. And the moment spirit says
That's
that,
so beautiful.
I see the light like right at that same time simultaneously. Or other times I can be meditating, or just even be having a loving thought with my eyes open, and the
Yeah.
light just coincides with right-mindedness. So the light is symbolic of right-minded thinking. Just as kind of an extra
Mm-hmm.
incentive to keep going on the path.
Right, right. Normally I'll ask people if, and I know I've asked you this before, if you're a healer or a seeker. Since you're down your path, where do you see yourself now? As a healer or a seeker, or
Well,
as
so
both?
that's interesting, because now I do see myself as both. And I know that both are occurring in ways that are best. Like, first of all, as I seek, and of course seeking within, as I continue seeking within, I realize that I'm also healing others as I heal myself, because really, of course, there are no, quote, others. And even the workbook lesson of the Course, lesson 137, says, when I am healed, I am not healed alone. And so as I choose to accept the atonement for myself, other parts of myself are also being healed. but they're being healed in an impersonal manner, which is the way that's best for me. Because one lucid dream that I may have mentioned in a previous podcast with you is one in which I was talking to a spirit guide. So I had this lucid dream. I was talking to the spirit guide. I asked him a question about healing. He just automatically flipped the question on me and said, well, if you healed somebody, would it be enough just to know that someone out there was healed, or what you want to know of that particular instance and the particular person who was healed? And speaking from my ego, I said I would want to know.
Yeah.
And that was the end of that conversation, you know.
Did the spirit guide just leave? Say, oh, you're not ready.
Well, he didn't say it verbally, but non-verbally. I don't remember much more from the dream, and he definitely didn't speak anymore after that. And the interesting thing is that, again, the Course says that the miracle should be both impersonal and involuntary. So my seeing my brothers and sisters as whole should be all that I aim to do. Just realizing that they are the perfect essence of Christ, that they are the Christ, without trying to control the outcome of that. Whatever effects that may have in their journey, that's between them and the Holy Spirit. But by letting my ego get in the way, I would be kind of making the same mistake as my dad, which is another reason I believe I chose them, you know, with the Holy Spirit's repurposed perspective, was to learn that I didn't need to go that way of pride, and just to be aware that I am having effects in healing, but that the how and the how, where, and why, and what just aren't relevant to me. In fact, that would just throw me off my path and maybe feed the ego, because the Course warns us of taking credit for healing, because it says that egocentricity and fear are often synonymous. And so if I start thinking that I'm responsible for the healing, then I'm either going to become very fearful, or I'm just going to become very arrogant and say, you know, I really am doing all this. And really, ultimately, we're all healers. We're all channeling the Holy Spirit when we're choosing right-mindedness. So we're all as much healers as another.
We can have an effect and just have no clue about it. Like, I was just thinking, like, say this pen on the table, you know, I could decide to pick up this pen on the table and then be out at the grocery store and somebody needs a pen and I give it to them, and then that pen gets passed on to a third person, and somehow it's a miracle for that person. Like, we just have no idea often how our actions affect other people. We could heal other people and just have no clue. It could just be a glance.
That's true.
You know, and just have no idea. So maybe it's not for us to know, but maybe when it's for us to know, that's for our healing as well. Maybe.
And it's like you said, any act of love is a miracle. And I also think that spirit gives us what it knows is best for us. You know, like I personally am like a little child, you know, so sometimes I may say I want this or that, but spirit's going to give me what it knows is best for me.
Yeah.
So perhaps if it doesn't feed my ego excessively, it'll let me know at times I'm being of assistance. But other times, for me especially, it's more helpful for me perhaps just to realize that I am being of assistance without knowing how all of that fits together.
Yeah.
But other people, on the other hand, I guess with in the case of souls who are more advanced, further on the path, without as much ego to be fed, then some people could definitely take that without letting it overinflate their egos. But this is just all part of the process, I guess.
Do you have a sense of, because I know you're not like I could bring up a movie or a sports team or something, and I know you don't necessarily engage in those things, but do you have a sense of the climate of the world, not literally the weather, but, you know, the climate of the world, and what do you think is going on? If that's like too big of a question, that's fine. But I was just wondering, like, what do you think is going on, and what do you think you and other mindful people are called to do?
I think we're just called to keep giving love, because what we're seeing on the outside right now is we're really just seeing the viciousness of the ego. And what the Course will say is that when the ego is threatened, it will go from suspicious to vicious. And what is being said in many books, including books by Gary Renard, is that more people are awakening today than they ever have in the history of the world. I
believe so.
And of course, then the extent to which we start to awaken will be the extent to which the ego will resist. And what is the ego's purpose of resisting and putting all this stuff on the news and making it seem like times are getting worse? Well, it's just that the ego wants us to think that times aren't getting better and that the mind isn't awakening and that we have even more of a reason to be fearful. But all of this is really a matter of smoke and mirrors. And so the goal for us, you know, light workers, is just to keep working through it, knowing it's an illusion and knowing things are really getting better. Because even though it may seem counterintuitive, that's actually the case. And I've read this book by Greg Braden. It's titled The Divine Matrix. And he has a sort of formula that can even be used to tell the small part that we must play in healing the minds of all. Because obviously we know it's not going to be the mainstream, it's not going to be the masses who get it in any given lifetime. But what he said is very encouraging in that he gives a formula saying that if you take 10% of the population and then even square that, so whatever that is, even the square root of the 10%, that's all that's needed to make an impact in any given area.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that with the experiments in which people do loving kindness meditations in the areas, and there are momentary effects of, lower numbers of car accidents, fewer crimes. So, and that's why we really are all healers in the moment we choose oneness and love and right-mindedness. In those instances, we're making differences that we don't even see. And so all that we're being called to do is, as one of the workbook lessons says, just to realize my part is essential in God's plan for salvation without worrying about the hows and the whats.
Right. So basically also just focus on our own journey of love and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we heal, not
Mm-hmm.
just ourselves, but the world.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's being done on an exponential level.
Yeah.
And it will be met with some resistance, but even that's a cover-up for the progress that's really being made under the surface. And that's why looking at the effects as an indicator of what's actually going on in the mind can be a very misleading thing, especially since sometimes the further we go, the more it's going to seem that things are going downward when actually they're going upward.
Mm-hmm.
But is also why there's a part of the Course that says what I have deemed as my greatest advances could indeed have been retreats, and what I deem as my greatest failures could be advances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're seeing in the world is it's just that it's like a cold front, versus a warm front. It's a clashing of two different types of air.
Yeah.
But really, what must be known is that we're spiraling upward this whole time.
Yeah. I believe that wholeheartedly. And then at the same time, sometimes I'm like, when are we going to see a shift? Mm-hmm. I mean, I know the shift is I think massive, gradual is the words that are coming to me. But then when I just see the other side is so stark, that so stark and, so the opposite of love, I think, wow, when am I going to see what I think I should see with my eyes? And maybe that I won't see that. I don't know.
That's a good question. And I think that we'll see it in increments over time. And I guess we'll see it in full effect once we are fully awakened from the dream.
Yeah.
Then we'll know that there was no one to leave behind. One of my favorite parts of Love Is Forgotten No One by Gary Renard is when his teachers tell him, when you leave this world, there will be no world to leave behind. And I really started to conceptualize that on an experiential level, just being there to see Gary Renard, give a speech in Asheville, North Carolina, and then just really thinking about it. Well, the only reason I'm seeing individuals who seem not to be enlightened is because I'm seeing them through the lens of my unenlightened mind. But if I reach the place of the Christ or the Buddha, then I would realize that, as they saw, that everyone is the Christ or everyone is the Buddha. And then from that state of an enlightened mind, there would be no world to leave behind by the time I left. Now, surely enough, for those still maybe experiencing the dream, we'll still leave the light behind for them to also, as a way forward in their linear experience. But outside of the linear experience, we'll realize that there is no, quote, other to awaken from the dream, because myself was also the other self, and then we'll just experience the perfect harmony and oneness with all.
Myself was also the other self. I am my fellow man. Yep. So at this point, do you know what you ultimately want to do? You ultimately want to minister groups of people. What do you ultimately, and do you know what that looks like, if that's the case?
I do want to be a minister somewhere, and I would like for it to obviously be a spiritual one. My experiences with fundamental religion have been enough for me to know that I'm definitely in an unorthodox path, and happily so.
Yeah.
And so I trust that an experience will open itself, an opportunity will open itself to me.
It will.
And it's very funny that you asked that. You must be, psychically intuiting to some possibilities in the ether, because I'm going to these courses, online courses. It's called ACIM1, and they're hosted by Reverend Kelly,
which is a course,
very very kind Course in Miracles teacher. And and I have heard of the possibility of an opportunities for work in the San Francisco area, and
Oh.
also that the possibility that after I finish this 2 year program, I'm still in the infancy stage of it, but after I finish this program, I could have the opportunity to maybe be an assistant minister of the CMC, which is the place that also hosts Course in Miracles conferences.
Mm-hmm.
And also, she's mentioned the possibility that there may be other positions in the meantime, maybe just for, I guess, more of, I guess, kind of like intern positions or just assistant positions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I trust that by going on my spiritual path and being open to others on their path, then that's really the way for me. Because
Yeah.
obviously anything can be spiritual, and obviously people who do any career, spirit isn't everything. As the workbook lesson 29 says, God isn't everything I see. And lesson 30, God isn't everything I see because God is in my mind. God isn't whatever we put our minds into, as long as we're looking through the lens of love. But in my particular case, I have always had the feeling that my area is going to be a place that's centered on kind of the explicit teachings of spirit. And
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting because even my dad would say to me when I was young that I was going to help people someday. And I guess it was probably a psychic intuition of his own.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it might even be a story similar to that of the Buddha, right? Because the father who intuits that the Buddha is going to either be he's either going to be, I guess, a great spiritual teacher, or he's going to be a king. I guess the father wants to do everything in his power to make sure that he's a king and stays in the materialism.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe the ego side of my dad that I'm perceiving, which is really my own self trying to hold myself back, was, I guess, also scared of my potentiality
Mm-hmm.
and tried to meet that potentiality with control. But now that I can see that I wasn't the only one trying to hold myself back from that, I can release myself through whatever seeming dream figures may be around, and just know that I am free to go the path of a spiritual teacher that I meant to go on.
Yeah. And what I love about you is because you've done different things. You were in the program at Emory,
Mm-hmm.
and you were doing something before that.
And before that, I had tried a couple of graduate Spanish programs. So this
Right.
was my third strike, and I like to say now, this is my third strike, and I'm officially out.
Right. You have looked at different areas to ultimately get to the ministry that is going to be right for you.
Mm-hmm.
And when it doesn't feel like the right fit, you move on, which is good. You contemplate it for a while because you're trying to figure out, well, do I move on? Do I try to keep this going for a little while? But you move on. So I think that's just so beautiful that when the right fit comes along, you're going to know it. And it may be something that just is to be manifested at a certain point of time.
Mm-hmm.
And this is on the way to that manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just going to be exciting to see what your ministry ultimately looks like.
Well, thank you. And I see all of this as a sorting out. I
Yes.
love the part of the Manual for Teachers in the course. It's under the section of development of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And it says that we must all undergo that phase of sorting out, which doesn't have to be painful. Even though it doesn't have to be painful, it often is, because the part of our mind the Holy Spirit part of our mind, the right part of our mind that knows that we no longer need things, will let them go. But the ego part of our mind that still wants to hold on to them will still feel a sense of loss through that sense of sorting out. So I definitely have undergone like various dark nights of the soul in this process of sorting out. But as I chisel away at what isn't,
Mm-hmm.
then that can be the means by which I realize what is. It's very similar to what the Buddha said. The Buddha didn't even begin to describe reality. In much the same way that the Course doesn't begin to describe love, it says that we're just simply removing the blocks to love's presence. Because
Right.
to describe love is way too big to do in an illusion like this one. And in the same way, the Buddha would only say the no self or the no I. So he only knew what the true self, enlightened self, was by what it is not in this illusion.
Right.
And that's definitely been my process. And Jennifer Hatley calls it the process of elimination to illumination.
Mm-hmm.
And that really resonates with me.
Yeah. And that section, it's in the Manual for Teachers. I think you
Mhm.
said the development of trust. That section bothered me for the longest time because it's so hard. I think that was my perception of it along the journey, because it is a sorting out. It's a letting go of things that you think you wanted. And then, maybe I don't want to let this go because I enjoy this and it gives me comfort and, all of that. And so it's a matter of growth. But what I love about that section is it also gets to think about what you want in every circumstance. And that's your heart. That's the heart. That's God's will. When you think about what you want in every circumstance. And that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. And that's what I try to do. I try to get to, well, what do I really want? And if I go against what I really want, it doesn't work out for anybody. I'm not showing up right. I'm not showing up authentically and sincerely because I don't really want to do it. So
it's true.
So, yeah.
It's all about learning to be self-honest. And it's also interesting, right? Because honesty is another one of the 10 characteristics of the teacher of God in that section of the Manual for Teachers. And so I think it's important for us to realize that being honest with ourselves is really is the best policy.
Yeah.
And by going our path in a genuine way, that really is how we can make the best impact in the lives of others.
And I think, too, this quote from a TV show, I'm going back to TVs, I wrote it down. It's something about how ultimately in this life we carry our pack alone. And I think as a human being, we think we're really alone. And I think that's part of the battle of this journey is that we think we're alone and we're not alone. And because I know I walk around and I think, well, if I just had just that person, that entity to just lean on, that understood me, that could give me the strength to go do this. You know what I mean? But I do have that. We each have that. We all have that, but we think that we're alone. Even when we're with someone else, we can feel alone because we're denying that love of God or a higher power that really propels us and that's really with us. Do you agree?
I do agree. And of course, again, that's right down the ego's alley. And I guess from the ego mind, of course, which we can all be in sometimes, the ego is alone in its experience. And the Course even says that the true mind, could never be aware of the ego. And of course, the ego mind could never be aware of God or spirit. And so the ego self really does believe it's by itself. And I guess whom we accompany determines our experience. If we accompany the Holy Spirit, then of course we have all the legions of manifestations that can come with that, because of course the angels, spirit guides, they're really all manifestations of the Holy Spirit. So we can be really well supported in that experience. But of course, ultimately when I choose the ego, then I will have the illusion of being alone, because of course the ego is nothing.
Right.
And of course, well, I mean, obviously this illusion is the one appearing as many. But even in multiplication, you learn this lesson. Well, what is 0 times 100? It's still 0. So.
Right. Well, James, this has been wonderful. And I really appreciate your wisdom and insight as always.
Oh, thank you, Adrienne. As always, it's an honor for me to be in this podcast, with you. And you're really doing great things. So I just want to thank you for your many spiritual contributions to the whole,
Thank you. It's just great, I think, I know for me, but for many to just be with you along your journey. It helps me. It enlightens me.
Well, thank you. You do likewise for me, because we're all helping each other on our healing path.
Right.
We're just all filling in these pieces of the puzzle and awakening together. And it's such an honor to be on this journey with you also, Adrienne. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Remember, you can listen to all of our podcasts on multiple platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook. And you can send me an email at letstarthealingpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, let's start healing.